Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Professor Chirantan Chatterjee, Professor of Development Economics, Innovation and Global Health at the University of Sussex Business School in Brighton, near London. In this episode, we will explore the growing influence of women in innovation and entrepreneurship within India and China. As these dynamic economies continue to rise on the global stage, the participation of women in technology, healthcare, and business is becoming increasingly pivotal. Professor Chatterjee, it's a true delight to have you on the podcast. We look forward to your valuable insights on this important topic.
Thank you, Deepak. Much appreciate your time and in your interest in chatting with me. It's also fun reconnecting with you after our shared I am Ahmedabad days. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Chatterjee, what is your research showing in this topic?
So basically, Deepak, I cannot claim that I am focused around gender empowerment in my research topic, but more broadly, I have an interest in looking at economics of innovation and development, and I use some theoretical lenses in that in the context of healthcare and pharmaceuticals. Now, as you look at economics of innovation, you also start wondering about the labor markets in innovation, which brings me to the questions around gender distortions, if that exists in innovation markets around the world and also in healthcare. There are two strands of research I want to highlight to you. One is a old, I would say, a literature review that I had done with a colleague when I was in IIM Bangalore long time back about the increasing role of women in entrepreneurship and innovation. As you can see in data sets with startups, right? So you have data sets in India, data sets are outside, where you can identify the presence of women founders, and you could see that over time, both in India as well as outside of India, these numbers have been increasing generally secularly around the world. And many years back, I wrote a literature review that in the case specific to India, that we must pay attention to these both from a societal perspective as well as from a policy and managerial perspective. More recently, in the context of healthcare, I have been doing a study with colleagues in University of Edinburgh and Sussex and IIM Calcutta about how women respond when they get a positive income shock in terms of their health expenditure. And this is a question of interest because development economists like Abhijit Banerjee and others have done a series of studies which show that if women get money or policy agency to take certain decisions, be that in education, etc., in households, they do a better job of distribution and long run sustainability with their decisions for the household's overall welfare, in contrast to men getting more agency or money with these stories. So there's a broad development economics literature around that. But unlike many of the prior studies, what we found in our India study was when women got a positive shock in income, they were not really spending it on themselves in terms of their own personal health and wellness consciousness. Instead, they were likely distributing these incomes towards the household's other expenses. So their actual healthcare expenditure in the data that we are exploring in consumer pyramids in CMIE and also with uh, EMR data from LV Prasad. In both these data sets, one administrative, one organizational, we are seeing a fall in health expenses by women, even if they have more money in their pocket. And you start wondering that is this because of a certain social and sacrificial mindset that women have, where even if they get money, they basically spend it not on themselves but on the rest of the household. So that's one strand of research I want to highlight. And the second strand of research I want to highlight is a more recent paper on how intellectual property has leveled the playing field for female innovators in Chinese AI ecosystem. Have been presenting that paper with colleagues from. This is also a joint work with colleagues from Sussex, Edinburgh, and Utah. And what we are seeing is in China, with more stronger intellectual property, uh, that has incentivized more STEM female innovators to show up in the patenting data in China, and it's correlated with the rise in STEM PhDs that are happening in China. It's correlated with more female inventors coming out of private firms in China, whether they are domestic or multinational firms. And it's also resulting in better quality of patents in the AI context. So both these pieces of research basically goes back to my original interest around economics of labor markets in the context of ideas and innovation. The broad message is that there are some positive news and there are not some positive news. And the positive news may be that trade laws, globalization may have equalized and opened up opportunities for women to participate in a more equal sense as men. But the not so positive news is that when government designs schemes or gives positive income shocks to women, social norms may be still holding them back on being more private and attentive to their own wellness, in a world where they may have to think about the household as a at large. So you can say that with these two bits of research, I'm just wondering to now, like, what is the message then for society at large, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and as firms and as managers. And that's something that you want to ponder, which is that gender empowerment is not a one-shot story. It's a story of small little changes over time. Governments do something. Our uh, social attitudes towards women participating in the labor market needs to change. And then you have to also deal with the global forces of globalization, which changes and brings in western norms and equalizes the level playing field. All these three things take time. Sometimes um, our mothers sacrifice for their girl children to do better in the next time period, as Michelle Obama was saying repeatedly in her Democratic Convention speech last week, about how mothers of everyone have sacrificed for their daughters tomorrow. And that's how I suppose women's empowerment and gender empowerment will happen, as my studies are also showing, um, in the context that I'm exploring them. Does that help?
Yeah, uh, insightful, Professor. Uh,
Yeah,
Professor Chatterjee, where do you think maybe the data or evidence gap?
at many places. So, I mean, in all the places where emerging economies like India are struggling with data, there should be a simple little component of making sure that we are carefully measuring if there are gender differences. So, for example, there's a lot of conversation on what is the unemployment gap in India, and especially after the pandemic. And we anecdotally know potentially that people don't have jobs, or they are only working in contractual gig jobs, but we don't have a measure of how many are actually employed, how many are not so employed. And even in that, what are the gender distortions? Is the unemployment more acute with men than women? We don't know that answer. So people are using all kinds of data sets to answer this question: PLFS, CMI, CPHS, sometimes surveys in certain households. But again, I mean, we get lost in the basic data set, and then after that we get lost in even the question of whether there are gender heterogeneities in the question of unemployment in India. So that's where one place where there is gap. The second gap is there should be a way the Indian Patent Office or LinkedIn datasets or datasets which show entrepreneurship and its rise in India, one can just sit down and be patient to mark out what is the presence of women in these data sets, right? But I don't see that appetite at all in many research groups in India. Rather, it's all about like anecdotally and cosmetically designing panels with females and showing that yeah, females are doing awesome in science and STEM and entrepreneurship, but no systematic exploration of all these discussions we love having in our ecosystem. Is that actually being borne out in data? If the Indian Patent Office, for example, follows the European Patent Office or the World Intellectual Property Office to see that in the last 30 years, how many women inventors have actually filed patents? And maybe the answer is negative, but a negative answer could also give answers, I mean, policy solutions for how to incentivize more policy for female patentees to file in Indian Patent Office? What is the constraint there? Is it cost? Is it because they don't know about intellectual property law? There could be a survey done to incentivize more women innovators, but we don't see that kind of an endeavor happening. We are just talking, and we are not focusing on systematic answers from data that could be easily dug out with all the computational firepower and our brains, young brains around. We could easily do this with employment data, LinkedIn data, venture intelligence data, or with Indian Patent Office data, even scientific publications data. All Indian institutes today have Scopus Cyverse, which is the go-to scientific database. And you can just identify whether women are publishing enough. Are they publishing in small or large teams? Are they first authors or last authors in these publications? Are they publishing more in certain types of sciences more than other types of sciences, etc., etc.? And no, I don't see anybody doing that analysis. And I wish somebody would do that analysis, listening to our podcast, especially doctoral students, because there's a ton to be done out there. Another interesting facet related to the recent Kolkata case is the lady who has been murdered and raped is basically a female doctor. And I know from my doctor friends that there are field specific heterogeneities in the way more women are taking up medicine. So, for example, ear, nose, throat, ophthalmology, many tell me have seen an influx of a lot of female medicine students, but not, let's say, surgical or traditionally gynecology, which was heavily dominated by females in as a field. Now there is a database where you can go and try to dig this out. It's called, in Indian, it's public. Indian Medical Association has a database which tells you how many MBBS and MD doctors are getting out every year from every college and region in India. The names and the gender can be identified with some effort, but it can be done, and you get it as a distribution over time. Now, if that's true, then in all the brouhaha that is happening with this Kolkata case, where is the effort to understand what are the gender differences in female presence in medicine in just MBBS and MD? How many are staying in the country? How many have left? And what are the state level disparities here? How is it correlated with policy measures that empower or disempower females? That's like a dissertation article in itself, right? A dissertation study in itself. So that I mean, it's a long ramble, Deepak, but I think that the gender empowerment, our Innovate Her podcast, will really benefit if people listening to us now take up all these ideas and do the analytics with the data and showcase to everyone concerned, whether it's an industry leader or a politician of any flavor, that this is the state of what we are seeing in the data. Some things are good, some things are not so good. This is the correlation they have with policy. You better buckle up and do it better, because without that, the economic development path that we are charting for ourselves over the next like 20 odd years are going to be repeatedly the way that we have been seeing in the last 12 years since the case of Nirbhaya, right? So that's something that I would love to see more done with data and evidence in the context of gender empowerment in India. And once you do that, there's another thing here. Once we do that properly, we can create general templates that we can showcase to the world who also are probably not systematically investigating this. So today, for example, when we have done a proper UPI, we are selling it to the world, saying, look at our financial transaction national interface and borrow from the architecture, and maybe you can do your own UPIs. Why can't we do that in the context of gender driven data interfaces that others will borrow from, and maybe can learn from those interfaces and from evidence to drive policy making, is something that bemuses me in some sense.
Do you have any theories of normative gender participation in economies globally, not just in India and China?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, now that we have talked about my research and the data, I think the larger story is conceptual, and we have to go back here to uh, what the Danish economist Esther Bostrup once talked about uh, with her hypothesis around the role of economic development, let's say on the x-axis, and what happens to female labor force participation on the y-axis. And she was arguing that it initially falls and then it rises. So it's a U. And feminist economics have termed it as a feminization U. And the reason it's a U is that Bosrup and others have argued and empirically tested, Avicenna and other economists have tested this, that initially when we were agricultural societies, there was a conversation around adopting the plow as a means of doing agriculture. The plow was heavy and it became male biased. The men became at the center of agricultural activities because of the plow, and the women adopted other type of activities in their household. But over time, as automation came in, agriculture got mechanized. This patriarchy that got embedded in agriculture got displaced, and women slowly came back to the center of society and households. Okay, so the plow hypothesis basically is uh, correlated with the feminization new hypothesis, where initial traditional societies had agriculture which was plow driven and patriarchy was deeply embedded. But as the plow was getting replaced, women started coming to the center of the conversations, and female labor force participation went up. I mean, a classic example of this is the discovery of the washing machine, which many studies have shown have saved so much of female labor in just washing clothes in the household. So it's an equivalent of the plow hypothesis, where the brute force work of washing clothes, which is equivalent to what people were doing with the plow, has been replaced with machines that have freed up time for women to turn their attention to the labor market and join the labor market. Now, the interesting thing is, maybe it's a you. Question is, different societies follow different trajectories of the U. Okay, so there is a falling part of the U. Perhaps the world has now come to understanding in a more nuanced way, the rising part of the U. But every society is following its own path on this, and even there, even developed societies have to fight the empowerment battle for women, even today. Like if you look at the US, the kind of calls that are coming out from Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris about abortion rights and women having choice to have or not have children, and the fear they have that the society may not be able to accept a woman president for the first time in American history. All these things tell you that even in most developed societies, the rising part of the U is never a done story. You always have to be on the watch to make sure that the U is properly settled into a rising U and it doesn't invert into an inverted U. Okay, so that's one observation. The second observation is that the U can be dramatically rising high with events like what has happened in the Nirbhaya case or now in Kolkata, with very aggressive laws. But that in itself may not be enough. There also has to be changes to social attitudes towards women, and their participation in the labor force, etc. And then the last story is that if the U inverts, because people give up essentially, right? Today, right now, just before I joined the podcast, the president of India has now spoken out on the Kolkata case, saying that this has been going on for the last 12 years and it's absolutely unacceptable. Da da da. Imagine the frustration that the highest office holding authority in the country seems to be afraid. She's on record, it seems to that she feels afraid. And this is a signal that goes out to society at large. Over the last couple of weeks, fathers of daughters have told me that they're scared about their growing children. They're thinking now more aggressively about planning an exit pathway for their daughters if they are getting educated and want to have a profession, because it seems like they're giving up that India will probably never change in our attitudes towards women. So this is a real worry that as a country one needs to have, in terms of not just being able to maintain the rise of the U, but to make sure that the U does not invert. Because if the U inverts, then female labor force participation will again fall, and then we go back to the world of the plow, a patriarchy embedded society. And here we have to appreciate what is happening in Afghanistan, for example, where a lot of women, for example, are living their Talibanized society for the Western world. It will be a merry for those who gain such intelligent woman labor from such economies, but it would be a sad story of the inversion of the U if that's the way it follows. Should the laws, should the norms, should entrepreneurship and innovation not take advantage of the rising part of the youth. So, in some sense, what I'm trying to tell you, Deepak, is that the concept here is that the feminization you is not a given. You have to work hard to maintain it. You have to keep an eye on data and evidence to see where are the distortions, like I was telling you, with the questions that can inform policy making. And the journey continues to make sure that there is true women's empowerment here. My last point here to mention also is the response of men as the U moves up. Okay, so um, it's a tricky story nowadays because you will see a distribution of responses from men. Some men will embrace the rising part of the U and gender equality conversations, but there are many men who are either openly or quietly grumbling about favoritism and da 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 towards women. So the question also then is incumbent on every society: how do you deal with this distribution of responses of men, those more embracing versus those more abhorring? Because that will also either enable or slow down the journey of the rising part of the youth. And that's a conversation that needs to be had more forcefully, not just in India, but around the world, with DEI and other conversations happening in the Western world.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Deepak?
Yeah, perfect, sir. Thank you, Professor Chirantan Chatterjee, for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights on InnovateHER, is the future female in India and China. Your expertise has provided us with a deeper understanding of the growing influence of women in innovation and entrepreneurship within these dynamic economies. We appreciate the time and knowledge you have brought to this discussion and look forward to seeing the continued impact of female leaders in technology, healthcare, and business. Thank you once again for being a part of this Business Talk podcast. See you soon, sir.
Thank you, Deepak. Just to remind our listeners, I am pleading for evidence-based policy way to understand gender empowerment, and I am asking everyone to keep an eye on how the U is rising and how even the men are responding to women's empowerment. And um, let's try to do that in a evidence-based way rather than in a policy-based way. And that's all that I have to humbly submit to anybody listening to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye bye.